Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Mallory Newell, Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Mallory, you have the floor.
Ellen, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Know the New America Public Opinion Update. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your schedule to join us for a download into the latest Ipsos public opinion data and also some discussion around what it all means. I am joined by two of my fellow colleagues and data experts here, Bernard Mendez, Senior Data Journalist, and Dan O'Leary, Senior Research Manager. Together, we are going to walk through some of our recent public polling going back the past few months, take a look at some of the biggest issues of the day, how the public's feeling on the economy, on immigration, on public health, and other topics of interest. And if we've got some time at the end, we're happy to take questions. So let's dive into it. Like I said, we've got a lot to cover today. So we've got a few different points on our agenda, closing out with some information about some new offerings that Ipsos has as we think about how to navigate the current climate that is rife with uncertainty and how brands can respond in this moment. But let's dive in first. So really, I wanted to, before I turn it over to Bernard to talk about the main issue in the economy, I just wanted to highlight this sort of grounding principle that underscores all of the research that we're doing in this moment. Obviously, the 2024 election illuminated some interesting trends in our society and really highlighted that, America is in limbo right now. And to do that, I think to understand that, the question that we keep coming back to is how do we know and understand this new America, right? Not just a politically polarized red or blue America, but how do we really navigate the society that we're in today? And on the next slide, we believe that there's sort of three main realities, three main principles that govern all of our research and the questions that we're asking. These are not necessarily new phenomenons, but we really believe they are capturing what is going on in this moment. The first is that there is widespread distrust in institutions, and frankly, a decline in interpersonal trust as well. Again, nothing new. This has been happening for decades, but this distrust is really pervasive in this moment. The second one is that Americans are nuanced and not binary. I think partisanship, as you'll see in these slides, explains a lot of how people feel about different issues today, but it's not the only thing. And I think we do ourselves a disservice if we just look at a specific issue and say Democrats feel this way, Republicans feel this way. You'll see examples of this nuance that exists on immigration, on public health, on all of the topics that we're talking about today. And finally, because of this, because we're in an environment where businesses, brands, researchers, people have to be mindful of these realities, words matter more than ever. Frankly, friction and unease is sort of the prevailing temperature today. And people are feeling uncertainty over both the current policy agenda and their long-term economic future. So again, we're in this kind of state of limbo. Again, these are the realities that we're dealing with right now. And I think it's really important to kind of keep these principles top of mind as we start to dig into the data. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bernard to talk about what's going on with the economy. Bernard, over to you.
Thanks, Mallory. So yeah, going to talk a bit about the main issue, the economy, and sort of drivers of what we think kind of are driving, changes in opinions, that being friction and uncertainty. So on the next slide, this might be familiar if you attend a lot of these webinars, but our main issue question, this time we're trending it and just looking at the top three most selected issues. What we see is that, at the top level, the top three issues have remained roughly stable over the past year, those being the economy and political extremism kind of tussling for that number one spot, immigration kind of remaining a third spot on that main issue list. We have seen some pretty big changes over the past couple of months in the top issue where as Trump, early on in Trump's term, political extremism and threats to democracy really surged as an issue. But as Trump has sort of cooled down his rhetoric and cooled down some of the more, early parts of his career, or early parts of his administration, that concern has kind of dropped down. So we're going to be looking to see how that changes in the next coming months, whether the economy sort of surges to be the top issue, or whether they stay kind of in this point right here where they are now. But really, what we're seeing is that the economy in particular is an issue that remains a dominant concern for most Americans. We'll talk a bit more about the economy going in the next slide. And what we've seen pretty much is that the economy, and particularly around the cost of living and inflation, remains an issue that most Americans are really concerned about. This is 80%, and this is something that holds true across partisan lines. Everyone is pretty concerned about the cost of living, inflation, the potential for a recession. So it's something, again, that a lot of Americans, when Trump was elected, the issues that they wanted Trump to address first in his first 100 days was the cost of living, was rising inflation that had pestered them for so many years. And that's something that Americans still remain highly concerned about. Next slide. One thing that we've seen early on in Trump's administration is that inflation numbers have remained relatively constant. They're far below where they were during the Biden administration, as well as job numbers also haven't spiked up yet, despite maybe some warning signs here and there. But really, when you look at the top line macroeconomic numbers, they haven't changed much since Trump entered office. At the same time, consumer confidence has also kind of taken a nosedive. So we're going to take a look sort of at why we think that might be happening, despite the macroeconomic numbers being relatively healthy over the course of Trump's administration. On the next slide, I think continues to demonstrate this point well, where there's a lot of stability in the economy, relative stability, as well as with people's personal financial situations, where a majority of Americans either say that their financial situation is either unchanged or that they're better off since Trump entered office. There is 40% that say that they're not as well off, but really what this reflects is a kind of contradiction between the macroeconomic numbers, people's personal financial situation, but worsening fears around the economy and worsening consumer confidence. One reason why we kind of think this has happened, is because of uncertainty. I think the next slide sort of demonstrates this well, where we've seen a massive spike in uncertainty under the second Trump administration, where I think this is a really interesting measure. It sort of measures how often the words like uncertainty and the economy appear in the same story in major news outlets as sort of a proxy to measure economic uncertainty. And this has spiked to pretty unprecedented levels, especially in April. Last month, it kind of cooled down. But what we've seen is that this level of uncertainty, so this kind of tracked with opinions around the economy, opinions around Trump, and it's sort of one sort of lens we've been looking at when we consider that a lot of the economic numbers haven't changed, a lot of people's personal financial situation hasn't changed, but attitudes towards the economy, attitudes towards Trump have slightly shifted. Again, one reason we think this has happened is because of this uncertainty bit. So the next section, we'll dig a bit more into this, where on the next slide, we see that under the Trump administration, uncertainty about the political climate and satisfaction ratings with the federal government are kind of going hand in hand right now, where people that have a lot of uncertainty about the political climate are a lot less satisfied with the federal government than people that have no uncertainty. There are other reasons to this, but I think this is good demonstration of the fact that right now, uncertainty about the politics of the U.S. are going hand in hand with attitudes towards the performance of the federal government. Next slide. So when we look at Trump's job approval rating, this kind of tracks kind of closely to the uncertainty slide we showed earlier, where Trump started out in a good place. He sort of saw a decline over his first 100 days. Sort of at the same time, this uncertainty really shot up, but has sort of seen a slight increase in approval over the past couple of weeks, partially aligning with the sort of decrease in uncertainty. And so on the next slide, we see that Trump's approval rating is actually higher than normal over the first 100 days of a presidency. Presidents typically see roughly a 3% decrease in approval ratings, partially due to the honeymoon effect wearing off, among other things. Trump saw roughly a 6% decrease over his first 100 days, but he's sort of been able to dig himself out of this hole as the rhetoric has kind of cooled down, as sort of uncertainty has decreased. So if he's able to hold on to that position, if uncertainty decreases, if there's more clarity around tariffs, he may be able to climb himself out of this hole, and not only climb himself out of this hole, but sort of be in a better position than historically his history would suggest. Next slide. One of the drivers of this uncertainty and sort of friction that has been created under the Trump administration is sort of tensions around the near-term benefits of tariffs and the potential impact tariffs could have, particularly in the near term, where if you look at how Americans view the impact tariffs might have on the economy in the next 12 months, there aren't a whole lot of Americans that feel it'll have a positive impact in the near term. Even among Republicans who overwhelmingly support tariffs, don't necessarily feel that in the near term that they'll have a positive impact. It sort of changes on the next slide when you look at the long-term effects. A lot more feel that tariffs could have a long-term beneficial impact on goods manufactured in the U.S., creation of more jobs, and the idea that short-term economic pain will be worth it in the long run. There's still a lot of division here, but a lot more Americans believe these sentiments and sort of see the long-term benefits, but not every American is willing to put up with the short-term economic pain to get there. As you can see in the last point, few Democrats think that short-term economic pain caused by tariffs will be worth it, whereas most Republicans feel so. So that's where a lot of the tension is coming from. The idea, I think a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people aren't willing to put up with this gamble and put up with the potential for short-term economic pain to get what potentially a better, prosperous future. And again, on the last slide, I think demonstrates this tension with the economy pretty well. Where if we separate Americans by what they're concerned most about, and look at Americans that are primarily concerned with the economy, approval ratings of Trump have declined pretty significantly, whereas Americans concerned with other things have been pretty stable in their approval ratings of Trump. I think this really reflects, the fact that Americans, by and large, as a whole, wanted Trump to address things like inflation, the cost of living, and the economy in his first 100 days, and early on in his administration. And I think, this sort of reflects that he hasn't been able to do that, even though the economic numbers haven't been too bad. Uncertainty is really kind of giving people unease about the economy. And we're sort of seeing this reflected here and in other places. But that still means that Trump has an opportunity to dig himself out of, a slight hole that he's been over the first 100 days. He started to do so, and I think if uncertainty is able to decline over the next weeks and months, or even if Americans get used to higher uncertainty, we could see, attitudes towards Trump shifting to a good direction for him. But those are things we'll be looking for. But with that said, I'll hand it over to Dan, who's going to talk a bit about immigration. Dan.
Thanks, Bernard. So yeah, I'm gonna move on to the topic of immigration now, which it's an area of relative strength for the president and the Republican Party as a whole, really. And we're going to see how perceptions around specific actions or policies don't necessarily move the needle on broader perceptions of the administration. So there was a shift earlier this spring with slightly more Americans disapproving rather than approving of President Trump's handling of immigration, as they did at the start of his term, where he started above water on this issue. That being said, I want to call your attention to the data on the left showing his performance on this issue during his first term. This did not used to be a winning issue for him. So if we're comparing his current approval, even if there's been a slight softening, it remains one of his biggest strengths overall, and a far bigger strength than it was in the past, despite some specific policies being broadly unpopular. So now let's dive into how Americans feel about those policies and what that might tell us. So immigration is an issue that's pretty consistently divided along partisan lines, but as Mallory alluded to earlier, partisanship tells us a lot, but it's not the entire story, and there's nuance that exists within that. And immigration is one of those issues where if you go a couple layers deeper, things are not so black and white. You can see how support for specific proposals or policies varies even among the Republican base. So when it comes to something like ending birthright citizenship, support among all Americans is lower than a lot of other immigration policies, and less than half of Republicans support it, whereas policies like quickly deporting alleged gang members has wider support among all Americans, though not quite a majority, and a strong majority of Republicans support that. Long story short, very few recent immigration proposals or policies have majority support, and that includes policies that have less of a partisan divide, like ending for-profit immigration detention centers. This kind of data drives home the point that immigration is one of the primary political fault lines of the day, if not the political fault line, and it can tell us a lot. Another example of this variance in approval that you see between specific policies is the deportation of international students who have criticized US policy in the Middle East. That does not see as much support, again, as the deportation of alleged gang members or something like that, where that has close to half of all Americans in support. So there's this gap that you see. So we've already thrown a lot of examples at you of specific immigration policies, but I want to focus in on some recent deportation policies, because these are another example of, okay, yes, society is polarized, but the policies that we're seeing here are broadly unpopular, and support among the Republican base is softer than some of the other immigration policies or proposals associated with this administration. Nevertheless, though, falling in line with President Trump and the Republican Party's relative strength on this issue, Americans are evenly split on the question of whether government efforts to arrest illegal immigrants have actually become excessive. So you can see how issues like this, they reflect that a certain level of uncertainty over the policy agenda that's being pursued by the federal government right now. And that contributes to the political friction that we've been referring to. And so at the heart of a lot of this is this larger debate over the constitutional rights of different types of immigrants. And that is not a question that has a clear answer for Americans. A great example of this is, if you look second from the left, 45% of all Americans agree that First Amendment protections should apply to everyone equally, including immigrants, regardless of their legal status. And roughly the same number of Americans, looking in the middle, roughly the same number of Americans agree constitutional rights should not apply to immigrants in this country without legal status. So we're seeing two diametrically opposed ideas that have roughly the same level of agreement, and neither with a majority of Americans in agreement, majority of all Americans rather. And these are not just complex legal questions, but almost philosophical, fundamental questions that Americans are wrestling with about our country, and there's just no consensus to be found right now. So with everything we just saw, and the specific policies we saw that some of which are broadly unpopular, you might be asking, how is it possible that that can be the case, that many of these policies lack broad support, and yet immigration overall remains an area of relative strength for President Trump and really the Republican Party? To answer that, it might be useful to consider that there is data showing that attempted border crossings or encounters at the border have declined sharply since Trump took office for a second term. And that's just one potential factor, but those kind of hard results on the ground might be enough for many Americans who may disapprove of specific policies or have issues with specific policies to remain in support of the president on immigration overall. So lots of really interesting, very complicated dynamics at play here. I could spend another hour talking about it. With that, we're gonna move on to our last major issue or policy area that we'll cover today, which is public health. So taking a high level view, Americans have a general distrust in institutions. We've mentioned that, and public health is an extension of that in some ways. In other ways, it might not be, as we'll get to. But broadly, Republicans are much more positive, while Democrats are almost entirely negative. And about a third of Americans overall would say that we're headed in the right direction on American public health. With that partisan split, it stands to reason that the new policy direction that some public health institutions like the CDC have taken or are actively taking could be a factor here. But speaking of those institutions, as of a couple months ago, a majority of all Americans still trusted major public health institutions for information. And that's interesting when you consider it in light of that pervasive distrust in institutions that we keep referring to, that really defines a lot about this current moment, because these institutions seem to be at least somewhat shielded from that trend. And some important context to keep in mind is that the trust in the CDC fractured since the pandemic. So at the start of the pandemic, it was an institution with widespread trust for information across partisan lines. And that quickly became partisan. And this is going back years now. There's a highly partisan split in terms of who trusts the CDC for information and who doesn't. But considering the positive outlook we saw that Republicans now have on the direction of public health, there's reason to think that the partisan split we see here, it might not completely flip, but it could shift. But that will be something we'll pay attention to in the future. Regardless of the partisan divides that do exist, which I just mentioned, when it comes to the largest public health institutions and programs that we have in this country, very few Americans want to see them weakened or eliminated. And the overall trust that we saw in public health institutions, and if not cynicism, let's say lack of optimism about the direction of American public health, that might help explain why this is. So even if there's sometimes disagreement about, the policy direction that the CDC takes, for example, nearly all Americans want to see the functions of these programs and institutions left as is at the very least, and a majority actually want to see them strengthened, with the exception of the ACA, though again, very few want to see it weakened or eliminated. So that's relevant when you consider the recent federal budget that passed through Congress for the upcoming fiscal year, yet to be signed by the president, but it could effectively remove some Americans from Medicaid. It might result in budget cuts to Medicare in the coming years. That's dependent on actions that Congress will take. A lot of moving pieces there, but any impact those potential cuts or reductions in the function of these programs, any impact that would have on public opinion or elections is entirely speculative right now, but it will likely be something to pay attention to going forward, because again, when it comes to the functions that these programs and institutions actually serve, very few Americans want to see them weakened. So moving on to vaccines, we saw in May that amid the measles outbreaks that were occurring, especially in the Southwest, a supermajority of all Americans still believed that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines are safe for both children and adults. What that might tell us is that even if there are lots of issues subject to debate in the public health sphere, like many policy areas, and even if trust of the CDC for information is divided along partisan lines, there are still areas where you see consensus among the American public. So just because there's pervasive distrust of institutions doesn't mean that every form of traditional expertise or authority is by extension widely distrusted. And finally, when it comes to vaccinating children against measles, we see another example of bipartisan consensus. So 3/4 of Americans, we fielded this in the same survey where we asked about the MMR vaccines, 3/4 of Americans agreed that it's the duty of all parents to vaccinate their children against measles, and roughly the same number agreed all children should be vaccinated writ large. I note that this doesn't mention COVID vaccines by name. They're more contentious, and I'll come back to that in just a minute, but looking at the middle data point, mandatory vaccination is a different beast, with nearly half of Americans feeling that it should be up to parents whether or not to vaccinate their children. And it's also interesting here that the partisan gap is not as large as you see on a lot of other questions in policy areas like immigration, for example, where public opinion is split. You see partisan gaps of 50, 60 percentage points. That's not uncommon. Whereas here, it's not so binary. And then when it comes to the measles outbreak specifically, most Americans did not express confidence in the current administration, with about a third feeling that the administration would prevent the outbreak from becoming a common illness, and roughly the same number feeling that the administration was handling it responsibly. So circling back to COVID vaccine recommendations, just to close this out here on the health section. So if you didn't see the news, Secretary of Health RFK Jr. recently announced that the CDC would no longer advise healthy children to receive the COVID vaccine. The CDC partially walked that back by keeping the COVID shot on the vaccine schedule for children, but there was new language about shared decision-making, which is relevant to that middle data point about parental choice. But all of this is to say there are shifting sands in public health right now, and the exact policy direction that institutions like the CDC end up heading in and the impact that has on public opinion regarding vaccines or public health institutions or public health more broadly, that remains to be seen. And with that, we're gonna move a bit away from federal politics, and I'll hand it back over to Mallory to talk about the intersection of politics and brands and how brands might navigate this current moment.
Great, thank you, Dan. Two things before we move on to this next section. One, Dan alluded to this, that the public health landscape is shifting quite a bit, right? Much of that data that you just saw comes from our regular Axios Ipsos American Health Index, which was really born out of when we were working with our partners at Axios to track during COVID, and we were surveying Americans every single week. We're set to field and release our next American Health Index later this month. So just wanted to put a little early plug in to stay tuned for that, because we're going to measure exactly some of these questions, right? Has trust in these institutions shifted? How do people feel about COVID vaccines for children and some of the new regulations that are put in place and some of the other questions of the day? So I just wanted to note that. And then before we move on to politics and brands, I just wanted to kind of underscore and sum up a few things. When we did our last presentation about 2 months ago, we focused a lot on President Trump's first 100 days and measuring his first 100 days in office historically. And now we're actually kind of looking at, okay, what do the next 100 days look like? And I think from this data, the story that we're seeing is that there is a lot of friction and uncertainty, but perhaps, maybe some cautious optimism for the future. And, again, I want to circle back to a point that Bernard touched on, which is really that the economy is so crucial here because that is the issue that President Trump was reelected on, right? We know through our analysis of both elections in the US and abroad that the candidate that is strongest on the main issue has an advantage the vast majority of the time going into an election. President Trump, then candidate Donald Trump, was seen as strongest on the economy, which was the main issue that the American public cares about. Republicans continue to hold an advantage over the Democratic Party on managing the economy. But there is sort of this unease that I think is created by a little bit of misalignment, we'll say. As we pointed out in the data, cost of living, the economy, these are still Americans' main concerns. But if we look at the points in time where President Trump's focus had diverged, right? A lot of, look back to Liberation Day, as it was called, or a heavy focus on immigration. Public perception, that makes people a little bit nervous. And that's where I think we see friction increasing. But then do we see friction subsiding as, he has kind of pulled back on some of the really strong, widespread tariffs, as we've started to see DOGE kind of recede back out of the spotlight? Is it sort of a friction increasing, friction subsiding pattern? I think that remains to be seen, but it's something that we're keeping an eye on. So now let's turn to talking about politics and brands. If we can go to the next slide. So in honor of Pride Month, June is Pride Month, we wanted to share some data. This is from a GLAAD survey. Our partners at GLAAD commissioned a survey on Ipsos's knowledge panel that was released just recently that really asks about this intersection of companies wading into politics on a number of different issues. And these two data points at first hand seem a little bit contradictory. So what do we make of this? We see that 3 in 4 Americans agree that companies should care about their bottom line more than politics. Okay, right? Finances have to come first. But at the same time, a supermajority, and this is true for people regardless of partisan affiliation, feel that business leaders have a responsibility to speak up to things that matter to their consumers and their shareholders. Moreover, we actually just released some data. You're not seeing it visually. It came out literally an hour and a half ago. Also with our partners at Axios, kind of unpacking this very same phenomenon. On the one hand, we see that nearly half of Americans feel that it's inappropriate for companies to speak out on political or social issues. Far more say it's inappropriate than appropriate, and there's a good chunk, about 1 in 3, that are somewhere in the middle. So one might read that and just kind of say, okay, companies really need to stay out of it. That's what the public is telling us. But at the same time, within that survey, we see a similar phenomenon that we see in this GLAAD data, which is that the majority of Americans say that companies should speak out on issues that could affect their employees. And about half say that companies have a responsibility to speak out on issues that could affect their customers. So there is this tension that exists that I think speaks to the current landscape that brands have to navigate and how challenging it can be. Let's go to the next slide. So given that it is Pride Month, we wanted to showcase some specific data points here about corporate actions supporting the LGBTQ+ community. This is from that same survey that GLAAD fielded and was released recently. So again, we see, roughly half, right? If you just kind of look, the public is sort of evenly split on whether or not they're comfortable with companies sponsoring an event for Pride Month, releasing merchandise for Pride Month, changing their logo, publicly supporting LGBTQ organizations. But this is one, I'm glad that Dan called out, what are the issues where we see like a 50-60 percentage point difference between partisans? And it's true that, social issues, whether it's LGBTQ rights, whether it's DEI, we do still see that these types of issues fall heavily along partisan lines. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the survey also asks, okay, if they do release LGBTQ merch or Pride collections, does that have an impact on your likelihood to buy? And we did something similar in the Axios data that was released today, right? If a company takes a stand on an issue that you don't agree with, does that make you any less likely to buy their products and services? So when it comes to Pride collections specifically, we see that most Americans are in the middle. 55% say it wouldn't make a difference one way or another on their likelihood to purchase. However, when you look at people on the opposite end of the spectrum that say that it would have an impact, there's more that say that it would negatively impact their likelihood to purchase than positive. So again, it's a potential warning sign, but not a blanket corporation should stay out of this. Here is where I think it is instructive to also look at this data broken out by partisan lines. And you see that a bare majority of Republicans say that it would negatively impact their likelihood to purchase if a company were to offer a LGBTQ Pride collection or merchandise. So similarly, in the data that just came out today, we see that there's actually bipartisan agreement on this question of would it impact your likelihood to purchase, right? So we're not asking about Pride Month. We are just asking in general if a company spoke out on an issue that you disagreed with. And a slim majority say that, yeah, I agree. It would make me less likely to purchase their products or services. But in practice, we then asked people, okay, have you actually stopped purchasing altogether from a company because of a political stance? Have you made an attempt to purchase less? Or have you actually purchased specifically from somebody else because of their stance taken on politics? And we see that far fewer Americans, 3 in 10 at most, and that number falls based on how you ask the question, say that they've actually gone from, in theory, it would make me less likely to purchase, to, yes, I am actually voting with my wallet, right? We also see that there is a little bit of a partisan gap here where those who identify as Democrats are more likely to say that they have actually taken that step to either boycott or specifically purchase from a brand because of a political stance. In some cases, they're twice as likely as those that identify as Republicans to do so. So I think, again, and as we kind of transition into the next slide and coming back around to why it's so important to know and understand this new America, brands really do remain a trusted source for many people. And I think as a result, they have an opportunity to speak to their customers' values, but at the same time, it can be a minefield, and there is a risk in doing so. I think it really underscores the importance of understanding your customer base and ensuring your talking points are received well, which brings us back to here. These 3 grounding realities about widespread distrust in institutions, the nuance that exists in our political, social, and issue landscape right now, and how words and actions matter. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, if you kind of just look at some of these data points on the intersection of politics and brands, and you see, for example, that a plurality, but not a majority, say that it's inappropriate for brands to speak out. If that's the one takeaway, if you're then a brand that says, okay, we're just going to say nothing, we don't really believe that that's the answer, nor is trying to be all things to all people. We found through our research that brands that try to please everyone, or brands that don't say anything, risk being inauthentic, risk kind of being seen as vanilla or not part of the cultural context, for the next 4 years or however long this election cycle lasts. And also, finally, not connecting with your audience. I think that's really the key takeaway, right? So it is important to understand how to connect with your audience on the values that are important to them. And if you do speak out, do it in an authentic way. Let's go to the next slide. So of course, that question is, and I wanted to spend just a few minutes before we wrap up talking about how we at Ipsos are utilizing research, advisory services, and all of the tools in our toolbox to do this. We believe that there are 4 main ways of how brands should operate and should be activated in this current environment. The first one I think is critical and goes back to that last slide. In order to make these decisions that feel authentic to your business, your organization, your voice, you have to kind of understand what your brand is, right? Know the boundaries of these commonly held values, and know how your brand is perceived in this current landscape. I think going hand in hand with that is knowing who your audience is, right? So in order to be clear about where you stand on the issues and to be clear about speaking out as a brand in an authentic way, you also have to know who you're speaking to, who is your customer base, who you're trying to reach. Third, we view kind of messages and communications territories, treat it like you would a political issue. Do the message testing, do the research, test these ideals and see how people respond. And finally, along with that, test some strategies and look at different strategic directions to understand the nuances that exist in our society. And so finally, I just wanted to end here, it's very clear that the political landscape has changed, is changing. The business landscape is as well. And these are just some ways that Ipsos can help brands connect with their consumers, to align on key stakeholder values, and to communicate effectively in this environment. So here is a roadmap of what we can do, and just a few things that we can offer, whether it's trying to understand what the issue landscape is, and navigating consumer sentiment, right? Does that utilize some of our consumer research or custom platforms that we can provide? Or is it deeper with that, right? Trying to understand your brand on a global scale and how you're viewed across markets, or how to kind of tap into shared values that the American public or that your base feels, could we do some communications territory research? So we just wanted to share that. There's a link at the bottom of the page, and much like our public polling data, this is all public on the Ipsos website as well. So with that, thank you, Ellen, for dropping that link into the chat as well. Happy to take some questions for our final moments together. I'll keep an eye on the chat to see if we have any that come in. There's a question here about some of the politics and brands data that we released. Is there any other difference besides partisanship on consumer behavior and boycotting brands? And that's a great question. And I think that what we've seen is not really. We thought perhaps age, right? Our consumers of different ages more likely, and we didn't notice anything there. Income a little bit. I think to a certain extent, one's ability to, again, call it vote with their wallet is dependent on whether you have disposable income or not. So we do see that those that have a household income of $50,000 or less are less likely to say that they've actually taken that step to, boycott a company or to try and purchase less from a company because of their stance on an issue, compared to those with a higher household income. But truly, when you kind of look at this sort of say-do landscape, we know that it's relatively equal across the board. Those that say that they would change their purchasing habits, but those that do, there is a partisan gap. All right, let's see. In all of this data, what surprises you the most? Great question. I think one thing that is surprising to me is, I want to go back to immigration and use that as an example. I think that immigration right now is one of the big political cleavages or fault lines in our society today, if not the biggest. And I think that what is surprising is that we do get a wide range of responses and of attitudes based on the proposal that we are testing and how we ask the question. I think that to me is the best example of the nuance that exists in our society right now, and that we aren't just living in a polarized red-blue environment. Again, we are, but that's just part of the story. I think it's also interesting that in theory, and DOGE is a great example of this too, right? In theory, Americans they show signs of wanting more restrictions at the border. And, same thing with government, downsizing the federal government. In theory, Americans do want that. Public opinion polling tells us that. But in practice, when you lay out exactly how that looks and when you test some of the policies that this administration has undertaken, we see that many are underwater with the American public. And even as Dan pointed out earlier with immigration, we see some of those more hardline proposals where you even start to kind of see a little bit of the Republican base softening or their support diminishing. Thanks for that thoughtful question. All right, those are the only ones that we see. So as we close, I just want to thank you all for attending today. I did want to note that our next webinar is going to be 2 months from now, Thursday, August 7th. So stay tuned. And thank you again to my co-panelists, Bernard and Dan. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks for tuning in.